Before Moscow, before the tsars, before the Iron Curtain, there was a land of endless forests, warrior princes, and a people caught between East and West. This is where the story of Russia begins. Legend says the Slavs invited the Viking warlord Rurik to rule them, to bring order. Whether true or myth, this moment birthed a dynasty that would last 700 years, the Rurikids. Rurik's successors moved south, seizing Kiev, a city straddling trade routes from Scandinavia to Byzantium. By 880, Kievan Rus was born. This was no barbarian backwater. Kiev's princes built fortresses, taxed fur traders, and even besieged Constantinople twice. But in 988, Prince Vladimir faced a crisis. Pagan gods had unified the tribes, but could they compete with the empires around them? Vladimir chose Orthodox Christianity, drowning pagan idols in the Dnieper and marrying a Byzantine princess. Overnight, Rus joined the medieval world. Under Yaroslav the Wise, Kiev boomed. Laws were written, alliances forged with Europe, but like all empires, Rus carried the seeds of its own collapse. Princes turned on each other, and in 1240, the Mongols burned Kiev to the ground. The age of Kievan Rus was over, but from its ashes, a new power would rise. The Mongols would rule for 200 years, but their grip bred defiance, and from the shadows of subjugation, Russia's next chapter would be forged not with swords, but with silver and cunning. Meet Ivan Kalita, Ivan the money bag. While other princes fought, Ivan paid. Paid the Mongols to leave Moscow alone, paid rivals to step aside, and when the Mongols needed a puppet to collect taxes from other Russians, Ivan volunteered. With every gold coin, Moscow grew richer. With every favor, more powerful. And when the Mongols finally weakened, the moneybag's heirs would collect more than taxes. 1380. For the first time in a century, a Russian prince dared to fight back. Dmitry Donskoy marched his army to the Kulikovo field and faced the Mongols head-on. They won, not a final victory, but a promise that Russia could rise again. The Mongols burned Moscow to the ground, but Ivan's heirs remembered his lesson: survive, adapt, grow, and by the time the last Mongol riders vanished into the steppe, Moscow stood ready, not as a subject, but as the heart of an empire. And its next ruler wouldn't just wear a crown. He'd forge it in blood. 1547. For the first time in history, a ruler of Moscow was crowned not as a grand prince, but as Tsar, a word drawn from Caesar. A declaration to the world: Russia was no longer a vassal, it was an empire, and its first emperor would live up to his name, Ivan Grozny, the Terrible. In his youth, Ivan was a reformer. He crushed corrupt boyars, created Russia's first parliament, and expanded borders eastward, conquering Kazan and Astrakhan. For a moment, Russia seemed destined for enlightenment, but war has a price. And Ivan's soul would be the first payment. Paranoia became policy. The Oprichnina, a state within a state, burned dissenters alive. Even his own son fell to the Tsar's rage. By the end, Russia was a land of ghosts, and Ivan ruled them all. Ivan died as he lived, between madness and genius. He left Russia doubled in size, yet broken in spirit. But empires are not built by saints. They are forged by those willing to wield fire and bear its scars. 98. The Rurik dynasty, the bloodline that had ruled Russia for 700 years, was no more. No heir, no plan, only hunger for power. Enter Dmitri, or rather, a Dmitri, the first of many miraculously surviving princes. This one, a runaway monk turned Polish puppet, actually made it to the Kremlin. For 11 months, Russia bowed to a fraud. Polish armies sack Moscow, planting their flag on the Kremlin. Swedish mercenaries pillage Novgorod. Peasant warlords, the Cossack bandits, rape and burn their own villages. This wasn't war. It was cannibalism. For 15 years, Russia had no czar, only wolves. And when the last scraps were gone, they turned on each other. 1613. In this hell, they found salvation. In the last place anyone looked, a shy, sickly boy hiding in a monastery, the grandson of Ivan the Terrible's brother. The Romanovs had arrived. The road ahead would be drenched in blood, but for the first time in a generation, Russia had a future. Michael Romanov ruled for 32 years, not with brilliance, but with bone-deep caution. He let his father and the boyars govern while he healed the wounds of war, and it worked. By his death in 1645, Russia could breathe again. But to thrive, it would need a very different kind of czar. Peter, a boy czar raised in terror, exiled from power, forced to watch as Russia's old guard fought for control. But Peter wasn't like the rulers before him. He didn't hide in palaces. He escaped to Moscow's foreign slums, where European engineers and mercenaries taught him the secrets of the West, shipbuilding, warfare. Russia would remain weak unless it broke its own past. But before Peter could reshape Russia, he had to survive his sister, Sofia Alexeyevna, no mere regent, but a ruler in all but name. For 7 years she wielded power no woman had ever held, playing the boyars and streltsy against each other with a politician's cunning. Sofia's Russia was a paradox. She crushed rebellions with one hand while funding poets with the other. But her greatest mistake, underestimating the gangly teenager exiled to the countryside who was taking notes. By the time Peter tore power from his sister Sofia, he wasn't just a czar. He was a revolution in human form. And his mission was simple: drag Russia into the future by force if necessary. For 21 years, Peter waged war on Sweden, not for land, but for a window, a single port on the Baltic Sea, and at Poltava his Western-trained armies annihilated the invincible Swedes. St. Petersburg, his Venice of the North, would rise from these swamps. Peter didn't modernize Russia, he tortured it into modernity. Beards were taxed, noblewomen dragged to parties, his own son murdered. As Peter the Great lay dying in 1725, he left behind an empire at a crossroads. His reforms had transformed Russia, but the question of succession remained unresolved. What followed would become one of the most remarkable periods in Russian history. Nearly a century where the empire would be shaped not by czars, but by czarinas. The story begins with Catherine I, born Marta Skavronskaya, a Lithuanian peasant who rose from prisoner of war to become Peter's second wife. With no formal education but remarkable political instincts, Catherine's brief reign established important precedents. She created the Supreme Privy Council to govern alongside the monarch, a move that would have lasting consequences. Though her time on the throne lasted just 2 years, Catherine proved that Russia could accept female rule, opening the door for those who would follow. After the short reign of Peter II, the nobility turned to Anna, daughter of Peter the Great's half-brother Ivan V. Initially invited to rule with limited powers under the conditions of 1730, Anna quickly asserted her authority, tearing up the documents that would have made Russia a constitutional monarchy. Her decade-long rule saw the return of Peter's secret police and the dominance of German advisors, particularly her favorite Ernst Johann Baron. The infamous Ice Palace incident, where noble jesters were forced to marry and spend their wedding night in a frozen palace, demonstrated her willingness to humiliate the old aristocracy. Peter's daughter Elizabeth seized power in a bloodless coup in 1741, beginning a 20-year reign that blended cultural enlightenment with military expansion. She founded Russia's first university in Moscow and established the Academy of Arts. While her armies defeated Prussia in the 7 Years' War, Elizabeth's court became famous for its extravagance. She owned 15,000 dresses and banned repeat outfits at formal events. Yet she also banned capital punishment, showing the contradictions of her rule. The most remarkable of Russia's female rulers arrived as a German princess named Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst. Becoming Catherine II through marriage and coup, she would rule for 34 years, expanding Russia's borders further than any ruler since Peter. Catherine corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers while crushing peasant revolts, modernized Russia's legal system while maintaining serfdom, and conducted foreign policy through both brilliant diplomacy and ruthless power play. Her reign saw the partitions of Poland, victories over the Ottomans, and the establishment of Russia as a European great power. As the 19th century dawned, Russia stood at the pinnacle of European power, yet faced its greatest challenge. The revolutionary fires burning through Europe would test the Romanov dynasty like never before. The story begins with Alexander I, the enigmatic Tsar who would become both Napoleon's ally and his greatest nemesis. Alexander inherited a throne stained with his father Paul's blood, the result of a palace coup he may have tacitly approved. This trauma shaped his contradictory reign. A reformer who spoke of constitutions yet maintained autocracy, a mystic who sought divine guidance while playing power politics. His early years saw attempts at liberal reforms, including plans to gradually abolish serfdom, but these gave way to conservative reaction as revolutionary threats grew. Russia's complex relationship with Napoleon saw shifting alliances and betrayals. After defeats at Austerlitz and Friedland, Alexander made peace at Tilsit in 1807, even forming an alliance with France. But this uneasy partnership collapsed as Napoleon's continental system crippled Russian trade, while French troops massed on the border. By 1812, the stage was set for the most disastrous invasion in European history. When Napoleon's Grande Armée of 600,000 men crossed the Niemen River in June 1812, Russia faced annihilation. The retreating Russian armies adopted a scorched earth policy, burning their own lands as they fell back. The bloody Battle of Borodino in September proved indecisive but cost both sides dearly. Then came the fateful decision to abandon Moscow. The ancient capital burned for 6 days, leaving Napoleon's army without winter quarters. Napoleon's retreat from Russia became one of history's great military disasters. Harassed by Cossacks and peasant partisans, decimated by hunger and the Russian winter, the Grande Armée was virtually annihilated. Of the 600,000 who invaded, fewer than 30,000 would recross the Niemen. Russia's victory came at terrible cost, over 300,000 Russian casualties and vast swaths of the country devastated. In the war's aftermath, Alexander became Europe's most powerful monarch, instrumental in creating the Holy Alliance to suppress revolution. Yet victory brought paradox. While Russia stood triumphant abroad, at home Alexander grew increasingly mystical and reactionary. His later years saw the abandonment of reforms and the rise of police surveillance. When he died suddenly in 1825, rumors swirled that he had faked his death to become a wandering monk. The sudden death of Alexander I in December 1825 created a moment of dangerous uncertainty. As soldiers and officials swore allegiance to his younger brother Nicholas, a group of reformist officers saw their chance to transform Russia. Their failed uprising would shape the reign of the man who would become known as the most reactionary Tsar in Russian history. On a freezing St. Petersburg morning, some 3,000 soldiers gathered in Senate Square, refusing to swear allegiance to Nicholas I. These Decembrists, many of them aristocratic veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, demanded constitutional reforms and the abolition of serfdom. Their poorly coordinated rebellion collapsed within hours under cannon fire, but its legacy would haunt Nicholas for 30 years. The new Tsar personally interrogated the rebels, sending 5 to the gallows and hundreds to Siberian exile. Nicholas ruled with one overwhelming principle: autocracy must remain absolute. His creation of the Third Section, Russia's first professional secret police, and expansion of censorship created a surveillance state. Yet this was also an era of surprising modernization. Russia's first railways were built, the legal code was systematized, and state-sponsored nationalism flourished under the doctrine of orthodoxy, autocracy, and nationality. When Poland rose in rebellion in 1830, Nicholas responded with overwhelming force. After crushing the revolt, he abolished Poland's constitution and began a ruthless policy of Russification. This pattern would repeat throughout his reign, whether dealing with Hungarian revolutionaries in 1849 or Muslim rebels in the Caucasus. Nicholas positioned Russia as Europe's guardian against revolution. Nicholas's overconfidence led to his downfall in the Crimean War. What began as a dispute over Orthodox Christian rights in Ottoman lands escalated into a disastrous conflict against Britain, France, and Sardinia. Russia's technological backwardness became painfully apparent, its smooth-bore muskets and sailing ships no match for Allied rifles and steam power. The grueling siege of Sevastopol revealed deep structural problems in the Russian military and state. When Nicholas died in 1855, likely by suicide as defeat loomed, he left behind an empire humiliated and economically broken. Yet his stubborn resistance to change had only delayed inevitable reforms. The Crimean defeat made clear that Russia could no longer compete as a great power without fundamental modernization. This realization would force Nicholas's successor to confront the empire's most entrenched institution, the system of serfdom that had bound Russian peasants to the land for centuries. As the smoke cleared over Sevastopol, Russia stood at a crossroads. The rigid system built by Nicholas I had failed spectacularly. Now the question became whether reform could come from above or whether the empire would face revolution from below. The answer would come from an unlikely source: Nicholas's own son, Alexander II, who would become known as the Tsar Liberator. The Crimean War's bitter lessons forced Russia into an era of painful transformation. Alexander II, inheriting a broken empire in 1855, would attempt the most ambitious reforms since Peter the Great, only to discover that in Russia, even well-intentioned change could unleash dangerous forces. On February 19, 1861, Alexander signed the Emancipation Manifesto, freeing 23 million serfs with a stroke of his pen. This seismic shift ended an institution that had defined Russian life for centuries, but the fine print revealed the reform's limitations. Peasants gained personal freedom, yet remained bound to their communes, required to pay redemption fees for land they already worked. The disappointment of this half-freedom would fuel decades of rural unrest. The Great Reforms transformed Russian society. New zemstvo local governments gave provinces limited self-rule. Judicial reforms created modern courts, and military service was shortened from 25 years to just 6. Universities gained autonomy, censorship relaxed, and Russia's first city councils emerged. Yet each reform contained contradictions. The zemstvos had no power to tax. The new courts still deferred to officials, and the military modernization remained incomplete. When Poland rose again in 1863, Alexander responded with surprising restraint. before ultimately crushing the revolt. The aftermath saw intensified Russification, Polish language banned in schools, Catholic monasteries closed, and the very name Poland erased from official documents. This pattern repeated across the empire, from Finland to the Caucasus, as Alexander struggled to balance reform with imperial control. Ironically, Alexander's reforms created the conditions for Russia's first revolutionary movement. Educated commoners, inspired by socialist ideas, went to the people in the 1870s, attempting to rouse peasants against the regime. When this failed, radicals turned to terrorism. The secret organization Narodная Volya, People's Will, began systematically hunting high-ranking officials, placing Alexander himself in their crosshairs. After surviving several assassination attempts, Alexander approved a proposal for limited parliamentary representation, a potential first step toward constitutional monarchy. On the very day he planned to sign this reform, March 1, 1881, revolutionaries bombed his carriage in St. Petersburg. As the wounded Tsar stepped out to check on his guards, a second blast tore through his legs. He died hours later in the Winter Palace, his blood staining the snow on the very spot where Peter the Great had begun building his European capital nearly 2 centuries earlier. Alexander II's tragic death marked the end of an era. His reforms had set Russia on the path to modernity, yet satisfied neither conservatives nor radicals. His son, Alexander III, would respond with brutal reaction, while the revolutionaries who killed the Tsar liberator had unwittingly ensured their movement would face even harsher repression. The stage was set for Russia's final, turbulent march toward revolution. Alexander III saw his father's murder as proof that reform led only to chaos. He rolled back freedoms, tightened censorship, and unleashed the secret police. Revolutionaries went to the gallows. Minorities faced brutal Russification. Yet even as he tried to freeze Russia in time, the world around him was transforming. Steel mills and railroads spread. A new working class emerged. And in the shadows, Marxists whispered of revolution. When Alexander III died unexpectedly in 1894, his young, unprepared son Nicholas II took the throne. His first act? Declaring he would uphold autocracy just as his father had. It was a promise that would doom his dynasty. Nicholas was a family man, devoted to his wife and children, but as a ruler, he was tragically weak. When famine struck in 1891, he dismissed it as local shortages. When workers protested, his troops opened fire. And when Russia stumbled into war with Japan in 1904, the empire suffered humiliating defeats. The people had had enough. On January 9, 1905, thousands of workers marched to the Winter Palace, singing hymns and carrying icons. They wanted only to beg the Tsar for bread and rights. Nicholas wasn't even there, but his troops were. The gunfire that rang out killed hundreds. Bloody Sunday shattered the myth of the benevolent Tsar. Strikes spread, mutinies erupted. For the first time, Soviets' workers' councils appeared, a glimpse of the future. Nicholas survived only by issuing the October Manifesto, promising a constitution and an elected parliament, the Duma, but he never truly accepted reform. Within years, he was clawing back power, dismissing Duma, and relying more than ever on his wife and her mysterious advisor, Rasputin. World War I was the death blow. Millions of Russian soldiers marched to the front, only to die in droves, poorly armed and led. On the home front, food shortages crippled cities. The government crumbled. And in February 1917, Petrograd exploded. Soldiers mutinied. Workers seized the streets. Nicholas, stranded at army headquarters, was cut off from his own capital. On March 15th, in a quiet railroad car, he signed his abdication. The Romanov dynasty, after 304 years, was over, but Russia's torment was just beginning. The provisional government that replaced the Tsar would last only months before Lenin's Bolsheviks seized power. The empire was now a revolutionary state, and the Tsar and his family would pay the ultimate price. 3 centuries of tsars had ended not with a grand battle, but with a volley of bullets in the dark. And yet, even as their bodies burned in an unmarked grave, the legend of Imperial Russia would linger, a ghost haunting the nation it once ruled. The Tsar was gone. But Russia's agony had only just begun. In the chaotic spring of 1917, 2 governments now claimed to rule: the Provisional Government of politicians and generals, and the Petrograd Soviet of workers and soldiers. This was Russia's dual power, and it would not last. While most revolutionaries supported the new order, Vladimir Lenin returned from exile with one demand: all power to the Soviets. His Bolsheviks were a minority, but they had a plan. As the provisional government stumbled through military defeats and food shortages, Lenin's party grew bolder. By October, they were ready to strike. It wasn't a revolution so much as a coup. On November 7, Bolshevik Red Guards seized key buildings in Petrograd with barely a shot fired. At the Winter Palace, the provisional government was arrested over dinner. Lenin proclaimed a new workers' state, but across Russia, millions wondered, who had really won power? The answer came in blood. When Bolsheviks disbanded the Constituent Assembly after just one day, civil war became inevitable. Former Tsarist officers raised white armies in the south. Czech prisoners of war revolted along the Trans-Siberian Railway. Foreign troops, British, American, Japanese, landed to support the whites. Russia was being torn apart. The Bolshevik response was brutal. They instituted war communism, seizing grain from peasants, nationalizing industry, executing real and imagined enemies. The Cheka secret police unleashed a red terror. Yet somehow, against all odds, Leon Trotsky's Red Army began winning. By 1920, the whites were broken, though at terrible cost. Famine, disease, and some 10 million dead. As the fighting ended, Lenin faced a shattered country. His solution? A new socialist federation, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. On December 30th, 1922, the USSR was born. But Lenin's health was failing, and a quiet Georgian named Stalin waited in the wings. The revolution had survived, but what kind of Russia would emerge from the ruins? By 1922, the Soviet Union stood victorious but broken. Its cities in ruins, its fields barren, its people exhausted from years of war and revolution. The Bolsheviks had won, but now came the harder task: building their socialist utopia. And no one would reshape Russia more brutally than Joseph Stalin. Lenin had warned against Stalin's thirst for power, but when Lenin died in 1924, Stalin outmaneuvered his rivals, Trotsky, Zinoviev, Bukharin, one by one. By 1928, he stood alone at the top. His vision for Russia was simple: total control at any cost. Stalin declared war on Russia's backwardness. His 5-year plans demanded the impossible. Factories built overnight, mines dug with bare hands, steel production tripled in a decade. The cost? Millions of peasants driven from their land into filthy workers' barracks. But by 1940, the Soviet Union was an industrial power, just in time for the deadliest war in history. Stalin's war on the peasants was even crueler. To feed the cities and fund industry, he ordered farms collectivized, private land seized, crops taken at gunpoint. When Ukrainian farmers resisted, Stalin took their food anyway. The result? A man-made famine, the Holodomor, that killed millions. Starving families ate bark, rats, even their dead. Stalin's response? They're sabotaging the revolution. Even Stalin's allies weren't safe. In 1936, he turned on the Communist Party itself. The NKVD arrested hundreds of thousands, old Bolsheviks, generals, writers, even factory workers. Show trials forced confessions to absurd charges. Firing squads worked overtime. By 1938, Stalin had purged the army, the party, even the secret police. No one was loyal enough. No one was safe. In 1941, Hitler betrayed Stalin and invaded. The Red Army, gutted by purges, collapsed at first. Millions were captured. Leningrad starved for 900 days. But Stalin rallied Russia, not with ideology but with raw patriotism. Not a step back, he ordered. At Stalingrad, Soviet soldiers fought street by street, corpse by corpse, until the Nazis broke. By 1945, the USSR had lost 27 million people, but it stood victorious over half of Europe. Stalin emerged from the war as a global titan, but more paranoid than ever. Eastern Europe became Soviet satellites. Scientists and artists faced new purges. Even victory wasn't enough. When Stalin died in 1953, his doctors were arrested for not saving him. His corpse was laid beside Lenin's, but his shadow would haunt Russia for decades. Stalin had taken a broken country and made it a superpower, through terror, blood, and sheer will. The question now was, could the Soviet Union survive without him? Stalin's death in 1953 left the Soviet Union frozen in fear. For 3 decades, the USSR would swing between cautious reform and stubborn stagnation, never quite abandoning Stalin's system, yet never fully embracing it either. Nikita Khrushchev, the ebullient son of peasants, shocked the Communist Party in 1956 by denouncing Stalin's crimes. His secret speech began the thaw, political prisoners came home, artists breathed freer, and the USSR launched Sputnik, stunning the world. But when Hungarians rose up that same year, Khrushchev sent in tanks, proving reform had limits. His final gamble, placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, nearly triggered World War III before he backed down. The Politburo, embarrassed, quietly retired him to his dacha in 1964. Leonid Brezhnev's Russia preferred stability over revolution. The 1970s saw Soviet power reach its peak, nuclear parity with America, influence across Africa and Asia, even a brief détente with the West. But beneath the surface, the system was rotting. Corruption became endemic. The Afghan quagmire drained resources, and when Brezhnev awarded himself medals for fictitious war exploits while barely able to speak, the joke spread. What's the longest book in the world? Brezhnev's memoirs. They keep adding new achievements. Yuri Andropov, the former KGB chief, saw the crisis coming. He launched anti-corruption drives and even experimented with economic reforms. But his failing kidneys made him a dying man on arrival, and his 15-month reign changed little except to prove the system couldn't heal itself. Konstantin Chernenko's brief and enfeebled rule symbolized the stagnation of the late Soviet era. Physically debilitated to the point of requiring assistance, he embodied a gerontocratic Politburo whose members averaged 70 years old. His death after just 13 months in power underscored the systemic decay that would soon culminate in the USSR's collapse. As Politburo members carried Chernenko's coffin in 1985, few noticed the younger man walking behind them, Mikhail Gorbachev. he would try to fix the unfixable, and in doing so, would accidentally bring the whole system crashing down. When Mikhail Gorbachev became General Secretary in 1985, the Soviet Union was a superpower in crisis. The economy stagnated, the war in Afghanistan dragged on, and the people's faith in communism had evaporated. Gorbachev would attempt the impossible: to reform the Soviet system without destroying it. Gorbachev began with glasnost, openness. For the first time, Soviet newspapers published the truth about Stalin's purges, the Afghan war casualties, even corruption in the Politburo. The 1986 Chernobyl disaster became the ultimate test. When officials initially lied about the nuclear accident, Gorbachev forced them to admit the truth. But once the floodgates of criticism opened, they couldn't be closed. Economic reforms followed, small private businesses were allowed, elections introduced real competition. But perestroika was too little too late. The command economy resisted change while shortages worsened. The Soviet people, tasting freedom after 70 years, wanted more than half measures. The cracks became chasms in 1989. Eastern Europe broke free. Poland's solidarity movement took power, East Germans breached the Berlin Wall, and communist regimes fell like dominoes. By 1990, Lithuania declared independence, and Russia itself elected Boris Yeltsin as president, challenging Gorbachev's authority. In August 1991, hardliners attempted a coup, imprisoning Gorbachev at his Crimean dacha. For 3 days, the world held its breath as tanks rolled into Moscow. But the people resisted. Led by Yeltsin standing defiantly on a tank, the coup collapsed. When Gorbachev returned, his power had evaporated. On December 25, 1991, the red flag over the Kremlin was lowered for the last time. The Soviet Union dissolved peacefully, ending the 20th century's greatest political experiment. Gorbachev had tried to save communism by reforming it, but instead gave Russia its freedom, a gift the nation would struggle to understand for decades to come. As the Soviet flag was lowered over the Kremlin on December 25, 1991, Russia awoke to a new reality. It was no longer a superpower, but a fragile democracy stumbling toward capitalism. The 1990s would become a decade of chaotic transformation, where everything was for sale and nothing was certain. Boris Yeltsin's economic reforms came like a sledgehammer. Overnight, price controls vanished. A loaf of bread cost 200% more by noon. State factories were auctioned off for kopecks to well-connected insiders. Ordinary Russians saw their life savings evaporate as inflation hit 2,500%. The promised capitalist paradise looked more like a fire sale of national assets. From the economic chaos emerged a new ruling class, the oligarchs. Young, ruthless, and connected, men like Berezovsky and Khodorkovsky snapped up oil fields and media empires for pennies. They financed Yeltsin's 1996 re-election, saving him from communist challengers, then demanded their rewards. By decade's end, just 7 men controlled half of Russia's economy. As Moscow's elites grew rich, the Russian army suffered humiliation in Chechnya. The 1994 invasion turned into a bloodbath. Conscripts fought without maps or proper boots against hardened separatists. When rebels took a hospital hostage in 1995, Russian forces responded by shelling the building. The war ended in 1996 with de facto Chechen independence, a wound to Russian pride that would fester. Russia defaulted on its debt. The ruble lost 75% of its value overnight. Pensioners wept outside banks. The middle class vanished. Yet from this wreckage emerged a lesson. Russia couldn't be governed by Western textbooks alone. The stage was set for a new kind of leader. On New Year's Eve 1999, a little-known ex-KGB officer named Vladimir Putin became acting president. His first months saw a brutal new Chechen war and mysterious apartment bombings that rallied public support. When Yeltsin unexpectedly resigned, handing Putin the presidency, few could have predicted how completely this quiet bureaucrat would reshape Russia. The wild 90s had been a time of both exhilarating freedom and terrifying chaos. As the century turned, Russians were ready to trade some of that freedom for stability, a bargain that would define the next era. As the 21st century dawned, Russia stood at a crossroads. Exhausted by chaos, humiliated by decline, and desperate for strength. Vladimir Putin, the former KGB officer who had risen from obscurity, promised order. What followed would be a dramatic resurgence, but one built on contradictions. Putin's first task was to restore the state. The oligarchs were given a choice: submit or flee. Some, like Khodorkovsky, ended up in prison. Others, like Abramovich, kept their wealth but lost their political influence. The economy, buoyed by rising oil prices, began to recover. Chechnya was brutally pacified, its capital Grozny reduced to rubble and then rebuilt under a Kremlin-backed strongman. But stability came at a cost. Independent media was tamed. Elections grew less competitive. The 2006 assassination of journalist Anna Politkovskaya sent a chilling message. Criticism could be deadly. When term limits forced Putin to step aside in 2008, he installed his protege, Dmitry Medvedev, as president. For 4 years, Russia played at modernization. Skyscrapers rose in Moscow, tech startups flourished, and Medvedev even tweeted about iPads. But behind the scenes, Putin remained the real power. And in 2012, he returned to the presidency, this time for good. Putin's third term saw Russia shed all pretense of liberal democracy. Protesters were jailed, laws against gay propaganda and foreign agents stifled dissent. The 2014 annexation of Crimea sent Putin's popularity soaring, but also triggered Western sanctions. In Syria, Russian bombs helped the Syrian state, proving Moscow could still shape global events. Yet the cracks were showing. Oil prices fell, pension reform sparked outrage, and then came 2022, the invasion of Ukraine. A gamble that would redefine Putin's legacy. Facing NATO's eastward expansion, Russia moved to secure its interests in Ukraine, annexing Crimea in 2014 and launching a 2022 intervention after failed negotiations. While the West saw aggression, Moscow framed its actions as defensive, protecting Russian speakers and preventing Ukraine's NATO membership. The conflict became a geopolitical flashpoint, with Russia pivoting to Asian markets amid Western sanctions. And so, after 1,000 years of triumph and tragedy, Russia remains history's greatest paradox. A civilization that has been both Europe's savior and its scourge. A land of breathtaking art and unbearable suffering, of world-changing ideas and unbreakable chains. From the Viking princes of Kiev to the czars of St. Petersburg, from the revolutionary fires of 1917 to the upheavals of our own time, Russia has defied every prediction. Just when it seems to weaken, it rallies. Just when it appears to reform, it retreats into itself. It is a riddle, wrapped in a mystery, inside an enigma, as enduring as the Siberian taiga, as unpredictable as a Dostoevsky novel. Perhaps this is Russia's true destiny, not to follow the world's path, but to carve its own. To be forever suspended between East and West, between tradition and transformation, between the dream of empire and the hunger for something greater. And so, the story continues. The next chapter has not yet been written. But if history has taught us anything, it is this: never underestimate Russia. Never assume its tale is over. For when the world looks away, that is often when Russia surprises us most.